How does a civilization die? It does not happen with a thunderous crash, but in the unnerving silence that follows the marching feet of the last legion. In the year 410, the Roman eagle took flight from the shores of Britannia for the last time, not in defeat, but because the heart of the empire was bleeding out and the limbs were left to wither. For nearly 400 years, this island had been a province, a world of paved roads, heated villas, stone cities, and the comforting, soul-crushing certainty of imperial law. Now it was an orphan, left alone in the cold northern sea. What do people do when the order they have always known simply evaporates? They panic, they pray, and then they look for new masters or new devils. The cities, once hubs of commerce and culture, began to decay. Their intricate mosaics were covered by the dirt of squatters' fires. Their forums became pens for livestock. The great roads, marvels of engineering, became gauntlets of banditry. The island fractured, petty kings, Roman British warlords clinging to the tattered remnants of their authority, carved out fiefdoms from the corpse of the province. Their enemies were everywhere. To the north, the Picts, the painted people who had defied the legions for centuries, swarmed over the crumbling line of Hadrian's wall. From the west, Irish raiders, the Scotti, harried the coastlines in their sleek leather boats. Britannia was tearing itself apart. In this cauldron of chaos, a British warlord, a man history would remember by the title Vortigern, made a decision. It was a decision born of pure desperation, a gambler's final throw. He needed warriors, professionals who knew nothing but the grim business of killing, and he knew where to find them. Across the turbulent North Sea, in the marshlands and forests of northern Germany and southern Scandinavia, lived tribes of men who saw the sea not as a barrier, but as a road to plunder and glory. They were the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes. To the Romans they were pirates, a persistent nuisance. To Vortigern they were a potential solution. A deal was struck: land, food, and gold in exchange for protection. The first longships beached on the shores of Kent, carrying two Jutish chieftains, the brothers Hengist and Horsa. They were wolves invited into the sheepfold. Did Vortigern really believe he could control them? Or did he simply choose the devil he could see over the ones screaming at his gates? The mercenaries did their job with brutal efficiency. They drove back the Picts and the Scotti. They earned their pay in blood. But then they looked around. They saw a fertile land, a broken people, a power vacuum waiting to be filled. They had been given a foothold. They decided to take the entire island. The story goes that Hengist, a man of cunning as sharp as his sword, invited the British chieftains to a great feast to solidify their alliance. The Britons came unarmed, expecting diplomacy and wine. They received steel. On a prearranged signal, the Saxons drew hidden knives, the seax, the short, single-edged sword, from which they took their name, and a massacre ensued. 300 British nobles were slaughtered. It was a night of long knives that severed the spine of British resistance in the southeast. Whether this event happened exactly as the chroniclers tell it is a matter of debate. History, after all, is the propaganda of the victor. But what is undeniable is the shift that occurred. The hired guards became the invaders. The trickle of mercenaries became a flood of migrants. Entire communities packed their belongings, their gods, and their grievances onto ships and set sail for the promised land. They were not an army with a single leader, they were a swarm, a relentless tide of warrior farmers seeking land and a new beginning, and they were prepared to carve it out of the flesh of Britannia. They did not come to rule the Britons, they came to replace them. The conflict that followed was not a war of pitched battles between organized armies. It was a brutal, grinding generational struggle for the land itself. It was a war of raids and ambushes, of burning settlements and slaughtered communities. The Anglo-Saxons pushed west, and the Britons, the Romano-Celtic people who now called themselves the Cymri, the fellow countrymen, were either killed, enslaved, or driven into the rugged mountainous fringes of the west and north. Roman cities were sacked and burned, not out of strategic necessity, but perhaps out of a deep-seated contempt for a world the invaders could not comprehend. What use was a forum or a bathhouse to a man who measured wealth in cattle and honor in the number of enemies slain? They were men of the timber hall, not the stone villa. In this crucible of fire and desperation, legends were forged. A hero arose from the chaos of the British resistance, a war leader who is said to have united the fractured kingdoms and, for a brief, glorious moment, halted the pagan tide. He was a commander who reportedly won 12 great battles against the Saxons, culminating in a decisive victory at a place called Mount Badon. We remember him not by his British name, but by the one that echoes through eternity: Arthur. Was Arthur real? A king? A general? A myth? The answer is likely buried somewhere in between. He was probably not the shining, chivalrous king of later romance. He was a warlord of the Dark Ages, a product of his brutal time. He was the embodiment of a dying culture's last, furious roar of defiance. But even if his victories bought the Britons a generation of peace, it was not enough. The tide was irreversible. Arthur represents the end of one story, the story of Roman Britain. Hengist and Horsa represent the beginning of another. This new story would not be written in elegant Latin, but carved in crude runes on sword hilts and memorial stones. It would be a story of violence, of pagan gods who demanded sacrifice, of feuding kings who saw peace as merely a pause between wars. The old world was dead, burned to the ground. From its ashes, something new and terrifying was beginning to crawl into the light. The age of Britannia was over. The age of England had begun, not with a proclamation, but with the screams of the dying and the crackle of burning thatch. This was a birth drenched in fire and blood. The island was a canvas being violently scraped clean. The invaders did not simply conquer, they settled. They brought their families, their culture, their language, and their gods. They were not interested in assimilating into the Romano-British world. They were building their own on top of the ruins of the old one. This was not a conquest, it was a replacement. The genetic and linguistic map of the island was being redrawn, village by village, valley by valley. The Britons, who were not pushed into the western mountains of what would become Wales and Cornwall, were absorbed, their language and identity slowly fading into the new Germanic tongue, the ancestor of what we now call English. The invaders themselves were not a unified force. The Angles settled in the east and north, giving the land its new name, Angle-land, or England. The Saxons dominated the south, and the Jutes claimed Kent and the Isle of Wight. These were not nations, they were tribes, loose confederations of clans led by warlords whose authority rested on a single, brutal principle: the ability to lead men to victory and reward them with the spoils of war. Power was personal, charismatic, and fleeting. A king who could not deliver plunder and land would soon find a knife in his back, replaced by a more ambitious cousin or a more successful rival. The warrior was the center of this new society. His bond was not to a state or a nation, but to his lord, his chieftain. In the great timber mead halls, warmed by a central fire, these warrior bands, known as the comitatus, would feast and drink. The lord would distribute treasures, rings, armlets, swords, and in return, the warriors, his thanes, swore oaths of absolute loyalty. To survive the death of one's lord in battle was the ultimate shame. It was a world governed by the blood feud, where an injury to one member of a kin group had to be avenged by the slaughter of another. Justice was a matter of personal vengeance or the payment of vigild, the man price, a detailed tariff that set the value of a person's life based on their social rank. A king's life was worth a fortune in gold, a peasant's a handful of silver. This was a society built for perpetual conflict, a machine for generating violence. And for the next 2 centuries, that is exactly what it did. The war against the Britons slowly died down as the frontiers stabilized, but the Anglo-Saxons simply turned their swords on each other. A new era of chaos began, a war of all against all. From this brutal crucible, the first kingdoms were forged. Ambitious kings, no longer content with being mere tribal chieftains, began to consolidate their power. They conquered their weaker neighbors, forcing them into submission, creating larger and larger political units. This process gave birth to what historians later called the Heptarchy, the 7 kingdoms that dominated the political landscape of Anglo-Saxon England for centuries. In the southeast, there was Kent, the oldest and, for a time, the most sophisticated kingdom, thanks to its close ties with the Franks across the Channel. Along the south coast lay Sussex and Wessex, the lands of the South and West Saxons. To their north, Essex, the kingdom of the East Saxons. The vast Midlands were dominated by the powerful and aggressive kingdom of Mercia. And in the east, the kingdom of the East Angles. In the sprawling north, 2 kingdoms, Deira and Bernicia, eventually merged to form the mighty Northumbria, a realm that stretched from the Humber estuary to the Firth of Forth in modern Scotland. These were not stable states with clearly defined borders. They were fluid, predatory entities, constantly expanding and contracting. The dream of every ambitious king was to become a Bretwalda, a Briton ruler, a title given to the most powerful king who could claim dominance over the other kingdoms. It was an informal but deadly serious game of thrones. This endless warfare was not just random violence, it was a process of state formation played out in fast forward. Kingdoms rose and fell with breathtaking speed. In the 6th century, King Ethelbert of Kent was the dominant power, his influence reaching far beyond his own borders. A century later, it was the turn of the pagan kings of Mercia, like the formidable Penda, who waged relentless war against his Christian neighbours. Then Northumbria rose to prominence, its kings Edwin, Oswald and Oswiu achieving the status of Bretwalda. The fate of these kingdoms was often decided in a single, bloody encounter. In the year 577, the West Saxons won a decisive victory at the Battle of Diorum. This was more than just another battle. By capturing the Roman cities of Gloucester, Cirencester and Bath, they drove a wedge between the Britons of Wales and their kinsmen in the southwest peninsula. It was a strategic masterstroke that ensured the Welsh would be permanently isolated, their dream of a united British front against the invaders shattered forever. The Anglo-Saxons were masters of the island now, but their work was far from over. The real struggle, the fight for ultimate supremacy, was only just beginning. They were wolf kings, these early rulers, men like Ethelfrith of Northumbria, who, a chronicler wrote, ravaged the Britons more than any other English king. He was a pagan who fought with a cold fury, believing that his gods rewarded the strong and devoured the weak. In a battle near Chester, around the year 613, he saw a group of unarmed British monks from the monastery of Bangor-on-Dee praying for a Saxon defeat. "If they are crying to their God against us," he declared, "then they are fighting against us even if they do not bear arms." He ordered them all to be slaughtered, some 1,200 men. This was the spirit of the age. A king's power was measured by his ferocity, his reputation, his ability to instill terror in his enemies and command unwavering loyalty from his followers. These were not statesmen or administrators, they were warlords, first and foremost. Their courts were not palaces but mobile war camps. They governed from the saddle, constantly moving through their territories to consume the food renders owed to them by their subjects. To stop moving was to starve, and to show weakness was to invite a rival to tear the crown from your head. This was the world the Anglo-Saxons had made, a violent, chaotic, but brutally dynamic arena where kingdoms were forged in the heat of battle and borders were drawn with the blade of a sword. The foundation of England was being laid, not with careful planning, but with the primal fury of a people who had fought their way out of obscurity and now fought each other for the ultimate prize. You are witnessing the birth of nations forged in a relentless crucible of war. But what is the greater force in shaping a people, the will of a ruthless conqueror who unites through fear, or the shared identity of a people determined to resist him? Tell us your choice in the comments. These wolf kings who lived and died by the sword drew their strength from a worldview as grim and unforgiving as the northern seas from which their ancestors had come. To understand their fury, their fatalism, their almost joyful embrace of battle, one must look beyond the politics of plunder and into the shadowy realm of their gods. Theirs was a paganism not of gentle nature spirits, but of cosmic struggle, a universe locked in an eternal war between divine forces and the monstrous powers of chaos. It was a faith perfectly suited to a warrior society, a spiritual engine for a world of violence. At the head of their pantheon stood Woden, a figure of profound complexity. He was not a benevolent father god, but a mercurial, one-eyed wanderer, a seeker of wisdom, a master of runes and magic, and, above all, the god of battle fury and death. Kings and warriors claimed descent from him, not for comfort, but for a share of his terrifying power. Woden did not promise his followers victory, he promised them a glorious death that would earn them a place in his hall, Valhalla, where they would feast and fight until the final day of reckoning, Ragnarok. He was the god of the ecstatic, the unpredictable, the terrible inspiration that could seize a warrior in the heat of battle and turn him into a berserker, an unstoppable force of destruction. Alongside Woden stood Thunor, the Thunderer, known to the Norse as Thor. He was a more straightforward figure, a mighty champion of gods and men, wielding his great hammer against the giants and monsters that threatened the world. He was the god of the common warrior, the protector of order, a symbol of strength and reliability. Farmers would call on him to bless their fields, and warriors would invoke his name to give them strength in the shield wall. Then there were gods like Tiw, the one-handed god of law and heroic glory, from whom we get the name Tuesday, and Frigg, Woden's wife, a goddess of love and destiny. Their mythology was not written down in sacred books. It was transmitted orally in the epic poems and songs chanted by Scops, the court bards, in the smoky clamour of the mead hall. These were tales of heroes battling dragons, of gods tricking and battling one another, of a world steeped in magic, mystery, and an overwhelming sense of doom. Central to this entire belief system was the concept of Wyrd. Wyrd is often translated as fate, but it was more complex than that. It was an active, impersonal force, a web woven by supernatural beings, the Norns, that determined the course of every life, both human and divine. Not even Woden could escape his word. This belief did not lead to passivity. On the contrary, it fostered a particular kind of heroism. Since the outcome of one's life was already decided, the only thing a man could control was how he met his fate. The ideal was to face it with courage, to build a reputation for bravery that would outlive the body. A man's dom, his judgment or glory among men, was the only true immortality he could achieve. We glimpse this world through the terse and brutal poetry that survives, poems like The Wanderer or The Seafarer, which speak of exile, loss, and the cold indifference of the sea, but also of the warrior's unbending will. And we see it, most spectacularly, in the treasures they left behind, buried in the earth. The most astonishing of these discoveries was made in 1939 at a place called Sutton Hoo in the Kingdom of East Anglia. There, under a great earthen mound, archaeologists uncovered the ghost of a ship over 80 feet long that had been hauled ashore to serve as the tomb of a great king. The body had long since dissolved in the acidic soil, but the treasures buried with him were breathtaking. There was a magnificent helmet with a human face mask, intricately decorated with scenes of warriors. There was a massive shield, a sword with a golden hilt, silver bowls from the Byzantine Empire, gold coins from the kingdom of the Franks. It was a hoard of unimaginable wealth and artistry, a testament to the power and far-reaching connections of this supposedly isolated and barbaric world. The king of Sutton Hoo was sent into the afterlife equipped as a warrior prince, surrounded by the symbols of his power a pagan chieftain on his final voyage to a world beyond our own. The burials showed that these were not simple savages. They were people with a complex culture, a deep sense of artistry, and a profound connection to their pagan beliefs. They created objects of stunning beauty, designed not for a church, but for the battlefield and the feast. This pagan worldview was resilient, but it was not monolithic. It was a collection of local cults and beliefs lacking a centralized priesthood or unifying doctrine. Its weakness was its lack of a grander vision beyond the battlefield and the blood feud. It offered no solace to the weak, no universal moral code, no promise of salvation for the common man. It was a religion for heroes, and most people are not heroes. And all along the western and northern edges of the Anglo-Saxon world, another faith persisted. In the mountains of Wales, in the remote monasteries of Ireland, and on the lonely island of Iona in Scotland, Celtic Christianity had survived the pagan onslaught. This was a Christianity different in flavor from that of Rome, more mystical, more austere, organized around great monastic communities rather than a rigid hierarchy of bishops. And it was these Irish monks, tough, ascetic, and burning with missionary zeal, who would soon carry the story of a different God, a God of forgiveness and love, back into the heart of the pagan English kingdoms. A clash of worlds was coming. It would not be fought with swords alone, but with ideas, symbols, and the very definition of what it meant to be a king. The hammer of Thuna was about to be challenged by the cross of Christ. The gods of the Anglo-Saxons were reflections of themselves, fierce, honorable, and doomed. Their greatest poetry was not about victory, but about heroic defeat. This fatalism made them fearless warriors, but it also made their world dark and unstable. It lacked a concept that could bind a nation together beyond the charisma of a single warlord, the idea of a kingdom under one god. While the Irish monks of Iona were already making inroads in the north, the decisive push for conversion would come from a different direction entirely. It came from Rome, the still beating heart of a shattered empire, and from a man who had never set foot on the island, Pope Gregory the Great. The story, perhaps apocryphal but too good not to be true, is that Gregory was walking through the slave market in Rome when he saw some boys with fair skin and blonde hair. Inquiring about their origin, he was told they were Angles. Not Angles, he is said to have replied, but angels. This encounter supposedly inspired him to launch a mission to convert the pagan English. In the year 597, a group of about 40 monks, led by a hesitant prior named Augustine, landed on the Isle of Thanet in the Kingdom of Kent. They had arrived at the court of King Ethelbert, the most powerful ruler in southern England at the time. Their timing was perfect. Ethelbert had married a Christian princess from the Frankish kingdom named Bertha, who had brought her own bishop with her. The king was no stranger to the new faith. Ethelbert agreed to meet the missionaries, but only in the open air, fearing they might use magic against him indoors. Augustine and his monks approached, not with weapons, but with a silver cross and a painted icon of Christ. They sang litanies, and their message was simple but revolutionary. They spoke of a single, all-powerful God, the creator of heaven and earth. They spoke of his Son, Jesus Christ, who had died to redeem humanity's sins and had risen from the dead, offering the promise of eternal life in paradise. To a king whose own gods offered little more than a bloody death and a place in a spectral mead hall, this was a potent message. It offered not only personal salvation, but also a powerful new political tool. A king anointed by the representative of the Christian God was no longer just the most successful thug in his tribe. He was God's chosen ruler on earth. His authority was sanctified, his laws divinely inspired. Christianity offered literacy, a written legal code, and a network of educated administrators, the clergy, who could help run a kingdom more effectively. Ethelbert, a shrewd political operator, saw the advantages. He converted, and on Christmas Day of that year, 10,000 of his subjects were baptized in a mass ceremony. Augustine became the first Archbishop of Canterbury, establishing the seat of the English Church that endures to this day. The new faith had its beachhead. But the conversion of England was not a peaceful process of preaching and persuasion. It was an ideological war, fought kingdom by kingdom, court by court, for the soul of the people. It was a story of dramatic successes and violent reversals. When Ethelbert died, his son reverted to paganism, and the mission in Kent nearly collapsed. In Essex, the local kings were converted, but after their death in battle, the people drove the bishop out. The old gods did not give up without a fight. The most formidable opponent of the new faith was Penda, the pagan king of Mercia. He was a throwback to the warrior kings of old, a staunch defender of the worship of Woden. For decades, he terrorized the Christian kingdoms, defeating and killing King Edwin of Northumbria and later King Oswald. To Penda, Christianity was a weakness, a foreign poison that threatened the warrior ethos of his people. He became the symbol of pagan resistance, a hammer against the encroaching cross. The fate of England's religion was often decided on the battlefield. When King Oswald of Northumbria, a devout Christian raised by Irish monks, faced a massive pagan army, he erected a wooden cross before the battle and prayed for victory. He won, and his success was seen as a sign of the Christian god's power. Kings built churches to buy eternity, while the Vikings burned them to take the gold here and now. The choice of which god to worship was often a pragmatic one. A king who won battles with a cross on his banner was a powerful advertisement for his faith. While the Roman mission pushed north from Canterbury, the Irish monks were pushing south from their base on Iona. They established a great monastery at Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria, which became a beacon of Celtic Christianity. For a time, England was divided between two forms of the same faith. The Celtic Church had a different method of calculating the date of Easter, a different style of tonsure for its monks, and a different, less hierarchical structure. These may seem like trivial issues, but they represented a fundamental question. Would the English Church look to the mystical, decentralized traditions of the Celtic world, or to the organized, centralized authority of Rome? The issue was settled in 664 at a meeting called the Synod of Whitby, hosted by Abbess Hilda at her monastery in Northumbria. After hearing arguments from both sides, the Northumbrian king, Oswiu, made his decision. He asked both parties if they agreed that Christ had given the keys to the kingdom of heaven to St. Peter. Both did. Since the Pope in Rome was the successor of Peter, Oswiu declared he would follow the Roman custom, lest he arrive at the gates of heaven and find the gatekeeper unwilling to let him in. It was a decision made with a touch of wit, but its consequences were immense. England was now firmly anchored to the mainstream of European Christendom, politically, culturally, and intellectually. The new faith had triumphed. It had not destroyed the old warrior spirit, but it had channeled it, given it a new purpose and a new, more powerful ideology of kingship. The transition was not always smooth. The common people often clung to their old beliefs, mixing Christian saints with local deities and nature spirits. But at the official level, the revolution was complete. Kings now issued law codes, not just based on tribal custom, but inspired by the Bible. They founded monasteries which became centers of wealth, learning, and political power. The church became a major landowner, and bishops and abbots sat in the king's council advising him on matters both spiritual and temporal. The new god provided a powerful glue to bind together kingdoms that were still little more than collections of disparate peoples. It gave them a shared identity as a Christian people, distinct from the pagan raiders of the north and the heretical Britons in the west. The sword was still the ultimate arbiter of power, but it was now wielded in the name of a king who ruled by the grace of God. This fusion of Germanic warrior culture and Roman Christianity would create something new and extraordinary. It would lay the foundation for a brief, brilliant cultural flowering, a golden age of learning and art that would shine like a beacon across a dark and turbulent Europe. The cross had conquered the hammer, and in doing so had created the conditions for a fragile peace, a peace that would allow for the creation of wonders. You've seen kings use religion as a tool for power. But what's the real motive behind a ruler adopting a new faith? Is it a genuine quest for spiritual truth, or a calculated move for political advantage? Let us know what you think drives history in the comments. The decision at Whitby, which aligned England with the intellectual and spiritual currents of continental Europe, had unforeseen consequences. It unleashed a torrent of cultural energy, particularly in the Kingdom of Northumbria. For a brief period, roughly from the late 7th to the late 8th century, this remote, war-torn kingdom on the edge of the known world became the most vibrant centre of learning and art in all of Europe. This was the Northumbrian Golden Age, a short, brilliant flash of light in the darkness. The engine of this cultural explosion was the monastery. But these were not just places of quiet prayer, they were bustling centres of production, scholarship, and artistic innovation. Two monasteries in particular stand out: Wearmouth Jarrow, founded by Benedict Biscop, and the island monastery of Lindisfarne. Biscop was an Anglo-Saxon nobleman who had renounced the world of the warrior for the life of a scholar. He made multiple journeys to Rome, returning with cartloads of books, relics, and even a cantor to teach his monks the authentic Roman chant. He built monasteries of stone with stained glass windows, a novelty in a land accustomed to wooden halls. He created a library that was unparalleled north of the Alps. His goal was to bring the best of Mediterranean culture to the shores of Northumbria, and he succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. In this scholarly environment at Jarrow, the greatest mind of the age was nurtured. He was a monk named Bede. Bede lived a quiet, secluded life, rarely leaving his monastery. He claimed his greatest pleasure was always in learning, teaching, and writing. But from his small cell, he devoured the entire body of existing knowledge: scripture, the writings of the Church Fathers, classical literature, science, and history. And then he began to write. His output was prodigious, covering every subject imaginable. But his masterpiece, the work that earned him the title, the Father of English History, was his Ecclesiastical History of the English People. It is a work of astonishing scholarship and narrative power. Bede was a careful historian. He gathered eyewitness accounts, consulted ancient documents, and was careful to distinguish between what he knew as fact and what he had heard as rumor. But he was not a dispassionate chronicler. He had a story to tell, the story of how the diverse, warring pagan tribes of the Anglo-Saxons were forged into a single English Christian people. For Bede, history was a moral drama, a demonstration of God's plan working through the lives of kings and saints. It is thanks to Bede that we know the stories of Augustine's mission, the Synod of Whitby, and the lives of the great Northumbrian kings. He, more than anyone, created the idea of an English nation. While Bede was writing his history at Jarrow, on the windswept island of Lindisfarne, other monks were creating one of the greatest masterpieces of medieval art, the Lindisfarne Gospels. This was a handwritten copy of the 4 Gospels, but it was so much more. Each page is a breathtaking explosion of color and intricate design. The artists fused different cultural traditions into a unique and vibrant new style. The swirling, interwoven patterns of Celtic art were combined with the more figurative, naturalistic styles of the Mediterranean. The script itself is a model of perfection, and the portraits of the evangelists are imbued with a solemn dignity. But the most astonishing feature is the carpet pages, entire folios filled with incredibly complex geometric and animal interlace patterns, so dense and detailed that they seem to vibrate with energy. This was not just a book, it was an act of devotion, a sacred object created to glorify God. It was a testament to the skill, patience, and artistic vision of the monks who lived and worked in this remote outpost of Christianity. It showed that the so-called Dark Ages were anything but. In places like Lindisfarne, a new and brilliant culture was being born. This cultural flowering was not limited to Latin scholarship and religious art. It was also the period when vernacular poetry in Old English reached its first great peak. It was in a Northumbrian monastery that the story of Cedman, the first known English poet, was recorded by Bede. Cedman was an illiterate cowherd who, one night in a dream, was commanded by an angel to sing about the creation of the world. He awoke to find he had been given the gift of poetry. More importantly, it was likely during this era that the greatest epic poem in the English language, Beowulf, was composed and written down. The poem tells the story of a hero from Geitland in modern Sweden who comes to Denmark to fight the monster Grendel. It is a story steeped in the pagan, heroic past of the Germanic peoples, a world of mead halls, monsters, and dragon-slaying warriors. Yet it was written down by a Christian poet who infused the old pagan tale with Christian themes of good versus evil, pride, and the transience of earthly glory. Beowulf is a bridge between two worlds, a look back at the heroic pagan age from a new Christian perspective. It is a poem that celebrates the courage of the warrior, but also recognizes the grim reality that all men, even the greatest heroes, must die. But this golden age was a fragile thing, a delicate bloom in a harsh climate. While monks were creating immortal works of art and scholarship, the world outside the monastery walls remained as violent as ever. The Northumbrian kingdom, which had provided the stability for this cultural flourishing, was tearing itself apart in a series of bloody dynastic struggles. Kings were assassinated, rivals were exiled, and the kingdom was racked by civil war. The peace was an illusion, a temporary lull in the storm. The very monasteries that were centers of learning were also centers of immense wealth. Their altars were adorned with gold and silver, their libraries filled with precious books. They were treasure houses protected only by their reputation for sanctity. But what happens when an enemy arrives who has no respect for your God, no fear of eternal damnation? An enemy who sees a church not as a house of worship, but as a storehouse of portable wealth defended only by unarmed men. In the late 8th century, strange portents were seen in the skies over Northumbria, terrifying flashes of lightning, fiery dragons flying through the air. The people were afraid, sensing that a great calamity was coming. They were right. On the horizon, new sails were appearing. They were long and sleek, with menacing dragon heads carved on their prows. The age of light was about to end. The age of dragons was about to begin. The year was 793. On a calm summer day, the 8th of June, the monks of the holy island of Lindisfarne went about their daily routines of prayer, study, and work. They were secure in the knowledge that they lived in a sacred place, a place protected by the legacy of St. Cuthbert and the power of the Christian God. They were utterly unprepared for the horror that was about to be unleashed upon them. From the sea came the long ships. Warriors poured onto the beach, screaming, wielding axes and swords. These were the Vikings, Norsemen from Scandinavia, and they had come not to pray, but to plunder. The attack on Lindisfarne was an act of shocking, unprecedented savagery. The monks were slaughtered where they stood. The sacred altar was desecrated, stripped of its gold and silver treasures. The precious gospels and relics were trampled underfoot. The buildings were looted and burned. Some monks were carried off into slavery. A contemporary chronicler, Alcuin of York, wrote in a letter of horrified disbelief, "Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets." The raid on Lindisfarne was more than just a pirate attack. It was a psychological shockwave that reverberated across the Christian world. It was a sign that the world had changed. God's houses were not safe. God's people were not safe. A new and terrible force had been unleashed. For the next few decades, the Viking raids were sporadic, hit-and-run attacks on coastal monasteries and settlements. They were a terrifying nuisance, but the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, preoccupied with their own internal wars, failed to grasp the true scale of the threat. They saw the Vikings as pirates, not as the vanguard of an invasion. Then in the autumn of 865, everything changed. A massive fleet, larger than anything seen before, appeared off the coast of East Anglia. This was not a raiding party, this was an army. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles called it the Mysel here, the Great Heathen Army. It was led by the formidable sons of the legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok, men like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson. They had come not just for plunder, but for land and vengeance. According to the sagas, they had come to avenge the death of their father, who had been executed by the King of Northumbria. Now they would make the whole of England pay. The armies spent the first winter in East Anglia, extorting horses from the local king and transforming themselves into a highly mobile force. In the spring, they rode north to Northumbria. The kingdom, weakened by years of civil war, was an easy target. The Vikings seized the capital city of York and crushed the Northumbrian army. King Ella, the man who had supposedly killed Ragnar, was captured and subjected to the Blood Eagle, a gruesome ritual execution. Northumbria, the kingdom of Bede, and the Lindisfarne Gospels, the cradle of the Golden Age, was the first to fall. It would never recover. From their new base in York, the great army turned its attention south. In 869, they marched into East Anglia. The East Anglian king, Edmund, confronted them but was defeated and captured. The Vikings offered him his life if he would renounce Christianity and rule as their puppet king. Edmund, a devout Christian, refused. According to the legend, he was tied to a tree, scourged, and then shot so full of arrows that he looked like a hedgehog. Finally, he was beheaded. He would be remembered as Saint Edmund the Martyr, a symbol of Christian defiance in the face of pagan brutality. But his defiance did not save his kingdom. East Anglia was conquered, and its lands were divided among the Viking warriors. The next target was the mighty kingdom of Mercia, which had dominated central England for centuries. The Mercian king, Burgred, tried to resist, but the Vikings were relentless. They swept through his kingdom, seizing town after town. In 874, they drove Burgred into exile and installed a puppet king in his place. The great kingdom of Mercia, the realm of the mighty Penda and Offa, was shattered. In less than a decade, the great heathen army had destroyed 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Their strategy was brilliant and ruthless. They exploited the political divisions among their enemies, moving with terrifying speed, striking hard, and then fortifying themselves in strategic locations for the winter. Now only one kingdom remained: Wessex. The kingdom of the West Saxons, which stretched across the south of England, was the last bastion of Anglo-Saxon independence. All that stood between the great army and the total conquest of England was Wessex and its young king. His name was Alfred. He had become king in 871 in the midst of the chaos, inheriting a throne at the worst possible moment in his people's history. His 4 older brothers had all reigned before him, and 3 of them had died fighting the Vikings. Alfred was not a natural warrior. He was scholarly and pious, known for his intellect and his chronic health problems, but history had called upon him not to be a scholar, but a savior. In his first year as king, he fought 9 major battles against the Vikings with varying success. He managed to buy a temporary peace, paying the Vikings to leave Wessex alone. But he knew they would be back. The Viking leaders were not just warriors, they were astute strategists. They spent the next few years consolidating their control over Mercia and Northumbria, parceling out land to their followers. They were no longer an army on the move, they were settlers, colonizers. They were creating a new Viking kingdom in the heart of England, an area that would come to be known as the Danelaw. In 878, they were ready to finish the job. On a winter's night, shortly after Christmas, a Viking army under their leader Guthrum launched a surprise attack on Alfred's royal estate at Chippenham. The West Saxons were caught completely off guard. Alfred barely escaped with his life, fleeing with a small band of followers into the vast, trackless marshes of Somerset. The last Anglo-Saxon kingdom had fallen. The King of Wessex was a fugitive in his own land, hiding in the swamps, his army scattered, his people subjugated. For the Vikings, the conquest of England was complete. For Alfred, the war was just beginning. Alfred was a king with no kingdom, a commander with no army. Hiding in the fens and marshes of Athelney, he was reduced to the status of a guerrilla fighter, waging a desperate hit-and-run war against the occupiers. It was during this time that the famous legend of the cakes was born. Taking refuge in a swineherd's hut, the disguised king was asked by the woman of the house to watch some cakes she was baking. Lost in thought, brooding over his catastrophic defeat, Alfred let the cakes burn. He was then soundly berated by the woman for his laziness, a peasant scolding a king she did not recognize. The story is almost certainly a fable, but it captures a profound truth. Alfred had been humbled, he had lost everything, but in that humiliation he found a new kind of strength. From his secret stronghold in the marshes, he sent out messengers rallying his loyal thegns, the ealdormen of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. He was not just fighting for his own survival, he was fighting for the survival of his people, his culture, and his faith. As he later wrote, he was fighting for a kingdom where people could live worthily. What makes a nation, backed into a corner, fight with the fury of the damned? It is the realization that they are fighting not just for land, but for their very existence. Slowly, secretly, a new army was being assembled. In the spring of 878, about 7 weeks after Easter, Alfred rode out from Athelney to a rallying point known as Egbert's Stone. There the militias from the last unconquered shires of Wessex met him. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the people greeted him as if he were risen from the dead. He now had his army. He did not waste a moment. He marched them for 2 days, seeking a decisive confrontation with the main Viking army, led by Guthrum. He found them at a place called Eddington. The battle was ferocious, a clash of 2 shield walls that lasted for hours. The Anglo-Saxons, fighting with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose, finally broke the Viking line. The Vikings fled to their fortress at Chippenham, but Alfred pursued them, besieging the stronghold for 14 days. Starved into submission, the Vikings finally surrendered. Alfred had achieved the impossible. He had come back from the brink of annihilation to win a total and decisive victory. But what he did next was even more remarkable. He did not slaughter Guthrum and his chieftains. Instead, he made a peace treaty. As part of the agreement, Guthrum and 30 of his most important men agreed to be baptized as Christians. Alfred himself stood as Guthrum's godfather. It was a masterstroke of statesmanship. By converting his enemy, Alfred had neutralized him, bringing him into the fold of Christian kingship and turning a conqueror into a neighbor with whom he could negotiate. The Treaty of Wedmore did not expel the Vikings from England. It formally divided the country. The Vikings would keep control of the north and east, the Danelaw. Wessex and its dependent territories in the west of Mercia would remain under Alfred's rule. A border was drawn, running roughly up the old Roman road of Watling Street. It was a pragmatic solution. Alfred knew he did not have the strength to reconquer the entire country. Instead, he focused on defending what he had saved, and he began a radical program of reforms to ensure that Wessex would never again be so vulnerable. He had realized that winning a single battle was not enough. To secure the future, he had to completely reorganize his kingdom. His most famous innovation was the creation of a network of fortified towns, or burhs. These were strategically placed strongholds no more than 20 miles apart, ensuring that no part of the kingdom was more than a day's march from a place of safety. Each burh was garrisoned by a permanent force of soldiers drawn from the surrounding countryside. This system provided a defense in depth that made the swift, penetrating raids of the Vikings impossible. To counter the Viking threat from the sea, he also designed new, larger ships, building the foundations of the First English Navy. But Alfred's reforms went far beyond military matters. He was a devout and learned man who believed that the Viking invasions were a punishment from God for the moral and intellectual decline of his people. He lamented that when he came to the throne, there were very few men south of the Humber who could even understand the Latin of the church services. He saw it as his duty as king to restore learning and wisdom to his kingdom. He began an ambitious educational program inviting scholars from Wales, Mercia, and the continent to his court. He established a court school to educate the sons of his nobles, and most remarkably, he personally undertook the translation of what he considered the most important books from Latin into Old English so that they could be read by a wider audience. He translated works of theology, history, and philosophy. It was a project of immense cultural importance, ensuring the survival of English as a literary language and laying the foundations for a new sense of shared English identity. Alfred was not just a king, he was a nation builder. He had inherited a kingdom on the verge of collapse and, through his military genius, his administrative skill, and his intellectual vision, he had saved it. He had created not just a fortress, but a culture. He had taken the shattered remnants of Anglo-Saxon England and forged them into something new, something that for the first time could truly be called England. Alfred the Great saved his kingdom by force, but he rebuilt it with knowledge and faith. What do you think is the more powerful legacy for a leader, the victories won on the battlefield or the institutions built in times of peace? Share your thoughts in the comments. Alfred's legacy was not just a kingdom saved, but a mission defined. He had drawn a line in the sand, securing Wessex and laying the groundwork for a new English identity. But the dream of a united England, free from Viking rule, was a task he would leave to his successors. The architects of this next phase were his own children, his son, Edward, who succeeded him as king, and his daughter, Ethelfled. Ethelfled is one of the most remarkable women in Anglo-Saxon history. Married to the ealdorman of Mercia, she ruled the English part of that kingdom jointly with her husband. When he died, she continued to rule alone, a rare and powerful female leader in a world of warrior men. She was known as the Lady of the Mercians, and she was every bit her father's daughter, a brilliant military strategist and a shrewd politician. Together, brother and sister worked in a coordinated pincer movement to roll back the frontiers of the Danelaw. Their strategy was patient, relentless, and methodical. They did not seek a single, decisive battle. Instead, they waged a war of conquest and consolidation, building a new burh, a new fortress, every year, pushing deeper and deeper into Viking territory. Edward advanced from the south, while Ethelfled pushed north and east from Mercia. It was a slow, grinding war of attrition, but it was devastatingly effective. They were a formidable team. Edward the Elder, as he came to be known, was a skilled and cautious commander, a worthy successor to Alfred. But it was Ethelfled who often captured the imagination of the chroniclers. She led her armies in person, planning campaigns and directing the construction of fortresses. She captured the key Viking strongholds of Derby and Leicester, and her influence was so great that the Vikings of York offered her their allegiance. She was a queen in all but name, a warrior who commanded the fierce loyalty of her Mercian soldiers. Her death in 918 was a major blow, but the momentum she had helped to create was unstoppable. Edward continued the advance, securing all of Mercia and East Anglia. When he died in 924, the project of reunification was nearly complete. The stage was set for his son, Alfred's grandson, to finish the job. His name was Athelstan, and he would become the first king of all England. Athelstan was a man of immense ambition and energy. He had been raised in the court of his aunt Ethelfled, and he had inherited her martial prowess and his grandfather's vision. He was a towering figure, both physically and politically, a charismatic leader with a reputation for both piety and ruthlessness. Soon after becoming king of Wessex and Mercia, Athelstan moved north. In 927, he marched into York and expelled the Viking king, bringing the last great Viking kingdom in England under his rule. He then summoned the kings of the north, the king of the Scots, the king of Strathclyde, and the ruler of Bamburgh to meet him. At a place called Ament Bridge, they formally acknowledged him as their overlord. For the first time, a single ruler from the House of Wessex held sway over the entire land of England. Athelstan's court became a centre of European diplomacy. His sisters were married to the most powerful rulers on the continent, including the Holy Roman Emperor. He styled himself not just as King of the English, but with grander titles like Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain. But his newfound empire was not secure. The conquered peoples of the north were resentful, and the surrounding kings were fearful of his growing power. In 937, his enemies made their move. A grand coalition was formed against him, a force of unprecedented size and diversity. It was led by Olaf Guthfrithson, the Viking king of Dublin, who sought to reclaim the kingdom of York. He was joined by Constantine, the king of the Scots, and Owain, the king of Strathclyde. It was a massive army of Norsemen, Scots, and Britons, united by their desire to crush the rising power of Athelstan. The two armies met at a location that is still debated by historians, a place called Brunanburh. The battle that followed was one of the largest and bloodiest fought on British soil during the entire Anglo-Saxon period. An anonymous poet, in a work now known as The Battle of Brunanburh, preserved in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, described the carnage in epic terms. The poem speaks of a full day of fighting from sunrise to sunset. It describes the hard hand play, the clashing of banners, and the grinding of blades. The West Saxons and Mercians, fighting side by side under Athelstan and his younger brother Edmund, clove the shield wall and hewed the linden woods. The result was a crushing, unequivocal victory for Athelstan. The battlefield was littered with the bodies of his enemies. 5 kings and 7 of Olaf's earls lay dead. The poem gloats that the Norsemen who survived fled to their ships in shame, while the field was left to the dark-coated carrion birds and the grey-pelted wolf. Brunanburh was more than just a military victory. It was the moment that sealed the unification of England. It confirmed the dominance of the House of Wessex and shattered the hopes of anyone who sought to dismember Athelstan's new kingdom. It was the bloody baptism of the English state. Athelstan, grandson of Alfred the Great, had completed the work his grandfather had begun. The disparate warring kingdoms of the Heptarchy were now a single realm, forged on the anvil of war. England was made. The century that followed Brunanburh was, for the most part, an era of peace and prosperity. Under powerful and effective kings like Edgar the Peaceful, the unified English state was consolidated. A single currency was established, a standardized system of administration was put in place, and a great monastic reform movement revitalized the church. England became one of the wealthiest and best-governed kingdoms in Europe. It seemed that the heroic age of struggle was over. The kingdom that Alfred had dreamed of and Athelstan had built was a reality. But history is a fickle mistress. A state forged in fire can be consumed by it just as quickly. A nation is only as strong as its leaders, and the memory of hardship can fade dangerously fast in times of comfort. The Anglo-Saxons had forgotten what it was like to be desperate. They had forgotten the terror that came from the sea. That forgetting would cost them everything. A new storm was gathering across the water, a second Viking age, and this time England would be led not by an Alfred or an Athelstan, but by a king whose name would become a byword for disaster. The late 10th century found England unified, prosperous, and dangerously complacent. The institutions built by Alfred and his successors were strong, but they depended on the hand of a capable king. And in the year 978, the throne passed to a 10-year-old boy who would grow into a man utterly unequal to the challenges he would face. His name was Ethelred, but history would remember him by a cruel and fitting nickname: the Unready. The name is a pun. His first name, Ethelred, means noble counsel. Unready, or unread in Old English, means no counsel or ill counsel. He was Ethelred the Ill-Advised, a king defined by his disastrous decision-making. For the first few years of his reign, the kingdom was managed by others, but the moment he came of age, the troubles began. And the trouble, once again, came from the sea. A new generation of Vikings, this time from a more organized and powerful Denmark, began to raid the English coasts. At first, these were small-scale attacks, but they grew in size and ambition. Ethelred's response was a catastrophic failure of policy. Instead of organizing a determined military resistance, as Alfred had done, he chose a different path. He decided to pay the raiders to leave. In 991, after an English army was defeated at the Battle of Maldon, Ethelred paid the Vikings £10,000 of silver to depart. It was called the Danegeld. This policy was a fatal mistake. It was like trying to put out a fire with oil. The payment did not buy peace. It was an advertisement of England's wealth and its king's weakness. It sent a clear message to every greedy warlord in Scandinavia: England is rich and unwilling to fight. The raids predictably got worse. The Viking armies grew larger, their demands more exorbitant. The Danegeld payments escalated: £16,000, then £24,000, then £36,000. A massive nationwide tax had to be levied to pay this tribute, bleeding the country dry. Ethelred was trapped in a vicious cycle of extortion. He was funding the very armies that were destroying his kingdom. The people suffered, the economy was crippled, and the morale of the Anglo-Saxon leadership collapsed. This was a state in the grip of a protection racket, and the king was the one writing the checks. Why didn't he fight? He had the resources. England was not the fractured collection of kingdoms that had faced the great heathen army a century earlier. It was a unified state with a sophisticated administration, but it lacked leadership. Ethelred was paranoid, indecisive, and prone to trusting the wrong people. The kingdom was paralyzed by political infighting and betrayal. In a moment of profound folly, Ethelred decided to switch from a policy of appeasement to one of shocking brutality. In the year 1002, on St. Brice's Day, he ordered the massacre of all Danish men living in England. He claimed to have uncovered a plot that they were going to treacherously deprive him and all his counselors of life, and then possess his kingdom. The massacre was a vicious and short-sighted act of ethnic cleansing. It was also a strategic blunder of epic proportions. Among the victims was said to be the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, the king of Denmark. Sweyn was not a mere pirate chieftain. He was a powerful and ambitious king, and he now had a perfect excuse for a full-scale war of revenge and conquest. The sporadic raids were over. This was now an invasion. For the next decade, England was subjected to a campaign of systematic devastation. Sweyn's armies marched through the country, burning, looting, and killing. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle for these years reads like a litany of despair. The army went wherever it pleased and did as much harm as any army could do. Ethelred's attempts to organize a defense were pathetic, often undermined by the treachery of his own nobles. The spirit of Alfred was dead. The will to resist had been broken. In 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard landed in England with a massive invasion force, this time determined to conquer the country outright. The north, already heavily settled by Danes, quickly submitted to him. He then marched south, and one by one the English towns surrendered. London held out for a time, but eventually it too fell. Ethelred, the unready, the king who had paid a fortune not to fight, was forced to flee the country, taking refuge with his wife's brother, the Duke of Normandy. Sweyn Forkbeard was proclaimed King of England. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom built by the descendants of Alfred had been conquered. In a strange twist of fate, Sweyn died suddenly just 5 weeks later. The English lords, seizing the opportunity, invited Ethelred to return on the condition that he promised to rule more justly than before. He returned, but the war was not over. Sweyn's son, a young and brilliant commander named Knut, took over his father's army. The bloody struggle continued for another 2 years. Finally, after Ethelred's death, his heroic son, Edmund Ironside, fought Knut to a standstill. The two young kings agreed to divide the kingdom, just as Alfred and Guthrum had done. But then, just a few months later, Edmund died, leaving Knut as the undisputed king of all England. The Danish conquest was complete. The ultimate irony was that Knut the Great, a foreign conqueror, would prove to be one of the most effective and popular kings in English history. He ruled a peaceful and prosperous England, a key part of a vast North Sea empire that also included Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. The conquerors had become the kings, and they ruled better than the king they had replaced. The line of Knut died out within a generation, and in a final flicker of life for the old dynasty, the Anglo-Saxon nobles restored a king from the House of Wessex to the throne. He was Edward, a son of Ethelred the Unready, who had spent most of his life in exile in Normandy. He was known as Edward the Confessor for his extreme piety. He was a holy man, but a weak king, more interested in building his great new abbey at Westminster than in the grubby business of politics. And he had one fatal flaw that would plunge his kingdom into the greatest crisis in its history. He was childless. As he lay dying at the beginning of the fateful year of 1066, the question of who would succeed him hung over England like a death shroud. The kingdom was a rich prize, and there were several powerful men who believed they had a claim to it. The great Anglo-Saxon era, which had begun with the arrival of mercenaries on the shores of Kent 600 years earlier, was about to come to a spectacular and bloody end. The board was set for a final cataclysmic contest that would decide the fate of England for the next 1,000 years. The year is 1066, a dying king, a vacant throne, and a kingdom holding its breath. The Anglo-Saxon world, forged over 6 centuries of war and faith, is about to face its final test. When King Edward the Confessor died in the first week of January, he left behind a power vacuum that 3 of the most formidable warriors in Europe were eager to fill. The first was Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England. He was an Anglo-Saxon, a proven military commander, and the king's right-hand man. He claimed that Edward had named him as his successor on his deathbed. The English Council of Nobles, the Witan, agreed, and the day after Edward's funeral, Harold was crowned King of England in the newly consecrated Westminster Abbey. He was the choice of the English people, but his crown sat uneasily on his head. 2 other claimants across the sea considered him a usurper. The second claimant was William, the Duke of Normandy. He was a distant cousin of the late king and a ruthless and effective ruler who had clawed his way to power in the brutal world of French feudal politics. William asserted that years earlier, Edward had promised him the throne and that Harold himself had sworn an oath to support his claim. To William, Harold was a perjurer, a man who had broken a sacred vow to God. He began to assemble a massive invasion fleet, securing the Pope's blessing for what he framed as a holy crusade to punish a usurper. The third claimant was perhaps the most feared warrior of his age, Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway. His name, Hardrada, meant hard ruler, and he had earned it. He was a giant of a man who had spent years as a mercenary in the elite Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Emperor before seizing the Norwegian throne. His claim to the English crown was tenuous, based on an old agreement between a previous king of Norway and one of Knut's sons. But Hardrada was not a man who cared for legal niceties. He saw a chance for the greatest prize of all, and he gathered a huge army and a fleet of some 300 ships to take it. King Harold Godwinson of England knew he was trapped. He faced the nightmare scenario of an invasion on 2 fronts. William was building his army in the south, across the English Channel. Hardrada was preparing to strike from the north, across the North Sea. Harold mobilized his army, the Fyrd, and his fleet of housecarls, his elite professional soldiers, and spent the summer waiting on the south coast, staring across the water, waiting for William's sails to appear. But the winds were against the Norman Duke. For weeks, a strong north wind kept his fleet pinned in port. By early September, Harold's army was running out of supplies and morale. The men of the Fyrd were farmers who needed to get back to their fields for the harvest. Reluctantly, Harold was forced to disband his army and fleet. It was the worst possible moment. The south coast was now undefended, and just as he stood his army down, news came from the north. Harald Hardrada had landed. The Norwegian army, accompanied by Harold Godwinson's own treacherous brother Tostig, had sailed up the River Humber and was marching on the city of York. The northern English earls hastily assembled an army to stop them, but they were utterly crushed at the Battle of Fulford. York surrendered to the Norwegian king. When Harold heard the news in London, he acted with breathtaking speed and determination. He reassembled his housecarls and any other troops he could gather, and began a forced march north that has become the stuff of legend. His army covered the 185 miles from London to York in just 4 days, a stunning feat of endurance. They arrived so quickly that they caught the Norwegians completely by surprise. On the 25th of September, Harold's army fell upon the Viking force at a place called Stamford Bridge. The Norwegians were caught unprepared, many of them not even wearing their mail armor. The battle was a savage and bloody affair. A legend tells of a single giant Viking berserker who held the narrow bridge against the entire English army, cutting down 40 men before being killed by a soldier who was floated under the bridge in a barrel to spear him from below. In the end, the English army was triumphant. The Viking army was annihilated. Both Harold Hardrada and Tostig were killed. It was a total victory, one of the greatest in English military history. Harold Godwinson had defeated the most feared warrior in Europe and destroyed the last great Viking invasion. He had secured his kingdom. But as he celebrated his victory, a messenger arrived, breathless from riding day and night from the south. 3 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, while the English were still recovering, the wind had finally changed. William of Normandy had landed his army at Pevensey. Harold was faced with an agonizing choice. His army was battered and exhausted from a hard-fought battle and a grueling march, but he knew that if he did not move, William would consolidate his position and ravage the south. Once again, Harold led his weary troops on a desperate forced march, this time 240 miles back to London. He rested there for only a few days, gathering what reinforcements he could, and then marched south to confront the Normans. He took up a strong defensive position on a ridge near a small town called Hastings. On the morning of October 14, 1066, the Norman army advanced. Harold's army formed a shield wall, a tightly packed line of warriors, presenting a fearsome, interlocking barrier of shields and spears. For hours, the battle raged. The Norman knights charged up the hill again and again, but they could not break the English line. At one point, a rumor spread that William had been killed, and the Norman army began to waver. William threw back his helmet, shouting, "I live, and with God's help, I will conquer." He rallied his men. The Normans then tried a new tactic: feigned retreats. They would charge, then pretend to flee, luring parts of the English shield wall to break formation and chase them down the hill. Some of the inexperienced English ferdmen fell for the trap, were isolated, and cut to pieces. The shield wall began to shrink, but it still held. The battle lasted all day, a brutal, grinding stalemate. But as dusk began to fall, the end came. A stray arrow, fired high into the air, came down and struck King Harold in the eye. He fell, mortally wounded. With their king dead, the English resistance finally broke. The housecarls fought to the last man around their king's body, but it was hopeless. The battle was over. William the Norman had won. The Anglo-Saxon age died with King Harold on that bloody hilltop. It was the end of a world. The Norman conquest would change England forever. A new French-speaking aristocracy would replace the old English elite. The language, the laws, the entire culture would be transformed. For centuries, it seemed as if the legacy of the Anglo-Saxons had been wiped out. They were the losers of history, a people conquered and suppressed. But history has a long memory. The foundations they had laid were too deep to be destroyed. Their language, though battered and reshaped by French, survived and evolved into the English we speak today. Their system of shires and local government, their common law, their very idea of a unified English kingdom, all of it endured, buried beneath the surface, waiting to re-emerge. The Normans won the crown, but the Anglo-Saxons won the nation. Their story is a testament to a brutal and profound truth. A nation is not born in peace. It is forged in the crucible of existential threat, hammered into shape by invasion, civil war, and the constant, desperate struggle for survival. They were born from the ashes of Rome, and they died on the field at Hastings. But in the 600 years between, these pirates, farmers, and warriors created England. The Anglo-Saxons lost. Their language, laws, and culture were nearly erased by the Norman conquerors. But centuries later, it was their legacy that became the foundation of modern England. What do you think is more important for history? Who achieved victory on the battlefield, or whose culture survived through the centuries? Write your answer in the comments, because history never ends.